The autumn wind swept across the fields surrounding Millbrook, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Emily Whitmore pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked beside Thomas along the familiar path that bordered the wheat fields. Her left leg, forever marked by the carriage accident that had changed her life at 16, caused her to lean slightly into each step, but she had long since learned to mask the discomfort. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I must tell you." The traveling salesman continued walking, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent. Emily had rehearsed this moment countless times in the small room she rented at Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, but now, faced with the reality of the conversation, her carefully chosen words seemed to abandon her. "I'm with child," she said finally, the words hanging in the crisp air between them, like autumn frost. Thomas stopped walking. His face, usually warm with the easy charm that had first attracted Emily during his visits to Millbrook, grew cold and distant. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that Emily felt as though she were looking at a stranger. "Are you certain?" His voice carried none of the tenderness she had expected, none of the joy she had hoped for. "Yes," Emily replied, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "I've known for certain these past 2 weeks." Thomas resumed walking, but faster now, as though trying to outpace the news she had just delivered. Emily struggled to keep up, her limp more pronounced as she hurried across the uneven ground. The village of Millbrook spread before them as they crested the small hill, a collection of stone cottages, the church spire reaching toward the darkening sky, and the market square where Emily earned her modest living as a seamstress. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and reputation was everything. "I need time to think," Thomas said when they reached the edge of the village. His words were clipped, businesslike, "to figure out what this means." Emily nodded, though something cold had settled in her chest. This wasn't the reaction she had hoped for, but perhaps it was shock. Perhaps, given time, he would see this as the blessing she believed it to be. That night, as Emily lay in her narrow bed at Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, she listened to the familiar sounds of the old building settling around her. She had lived here for 3 years, ever since accepting the position as the village's seamstress. It wasn't much, but it was home. By morning, Thomas was gone. The only trace of him was a hastily written note slipped under her door. "I will make this right, Emily, I promise. Give me time." But somehow, as she held the paper in her trembling hands, Emily knew she would never see him again. Mrs. Hartwell discovered the letter 3 days later while collecting Emily's weekly rent. The elderly woman's sharp eyes had noticed Emily's unusual pallor, her frequent trips to the wash basin each morning, and the way she held herself when she thought no one was looking. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Hartwell's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, "I believe we need to have a conversation." Emily looked up from her sewing, a christening gown for the baker's newborn daughter, and met the landlady's steely gaze. The letter lay unfolded on the small table between them, Thomas's words exposed to the harsh light of judgment. "I won't have unmarried mothers under my roof," Mrs. Hartwell declared, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "This is a respectable establishment. What would people say?" Within an hour, Emily's few possessions were packed into a single carpet bag. Her sewing machine, too heavy to carry, remained behind as partial payment for the disruption she had caused. As she stood on the boarding house steps, other residents peered from their windows with a mixture of curiosity and condemnation. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire in dry grass. By midday, Emily discovered that the baker's wife no longer needed the christening gown completed. The doctor's wife, who had commissioned a new dress for Sunday service, sent word that her services were no longer required. One by one, the women who had once praised her delicate stitchwork and fair prices found reasons to withdraw their patronage. Emily's first night without shelter was spent in the churchyard, huddled against a weathered headstone. The October wind cut through her thin dress, but the cold that settled in her bones went deeper than the autumn chill. It was the cold of complete abandonment, of a world that had turned its back on her when she needed it most. During the day, she sought work and shelter with increasing desperation. The innkeeper's wife looked through her as though she were invisible. The miller's family, who had known her since childhood, closed their door without a word. Even the widow Henderson, who had always shown kindness to those in need, could only shake her head sadly and explain that she couldn't risk her own reputation. As the days passed, Emily's appearance began to reflect her circumstances. Her dress grew wrinkled and stained, her hair escaped its careful pins, and the dark circles under her eyes deepened with each sleepless night. The villagers who had once greeted her with polite smiles now crossed the street to avoid her, their whispered conversations following in her wake like shadows. It was during this time that Edward Hawthorne first noticed her. The widowed farmer rarely came to the village, preferring the isolation of his property on the outskirts of Millbrook. But necessity occasionally drove him to the market for supplies he couldn't produce himself. He saw her from a distance, a figure that seemed to shrink a little more each day, moving through the village like a ghost among the living. Something stirred in Edward's chest, a feeling he had thought buried forever with his beloved Margaret. The carriage wheel hit the pothole with such force that 16-year-old Emily Whitmore was thrown against the wooden side with a sickening crack. Pain shot through her left leg like lightning, and when she tried to stand after the driver had helped her from the overturned vehicle, the world tilted dangerously. The bone had shattered just above the ankle, and though the village doctor did his best, the healing was imperfect. Emily would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life, a visible reminder of how quickly fate could change everything. Edward Hawthorne held his wife Margaret's hand as she labored to bring their first child into the world. The midwife's increasingly worried expressions told a story that Edward refused to accept. For 2 days, Margaret fought with the strength that had first attracted him to her, the determination of a woman who could birth calves, harvest crops, and still find energy to laugh at his terrible jokes over supper. But on the 3rd day, as the autumn rain hammered against the cottage windows, Margaret's strength finally ebbed away. The baby, a son they had planned to name James, followed his mother into the darkness within minutes of his birth. Present day. Emily sat beneath the old oak tree behind the church, the same tree where she and Thomas had shared their first kiss just 6 months ago. Her stomach growled with hunger, but the few coins remaining in her purse needed to last. She had learned to make a single loaf of bread stretch across 3 days, to find warmth in layers of newspaper tucked beneath her thin dress. The villagers had grown accustomed to her presence, treating her like an unfortunate but inevitable part of the landscape. Children were hushed when they pointed at her. Wives clutched their husbands' arms a little tighter when they passed, as though her circumstances might be contagious. From his position at the market stall, Edward watched the woman who had become the village's cautionary tale. He recognized something in her posture, in the way she held herself apart from the world, the same careful distance he had maintained since burying Margaret and their son in the churchyard where Emily now sought shelter. Each night, Edward returned to his cottage alone, eating supper at a table set for one, sleeping in a bed that felt vast and empty. The farm ran itself through habit and necessity, but the joy had gone out of the work. He tended his animals and fields with mechanical precision, finding no pleasure in the changing seasons or the simple satisfaction of a job well done. Margaret's presence lingered everywhere, in the garden she had planted, in the curtains she had sewn, in the way the morning light fell across the kitchen table where she used to read while drinking her tea. Edward had left everything exactly as it was the day she died, as though changing anything might finally make her death real. Sometimes late at night, he wondered if this was what the rest of his life would look like. An endless repetition of empty days, marked only by the gradual decay of everything Margaret had touched. The loneliness was a physical ache, but it felt like the only honest emotion left to him. As Emily shivered beneath her thin shawl and Edward stared at the empty chair across his supper table, neither could have imagined that their parallel solitudes were about to intersect in ways that would change everything. The morning of October 15th dawned grey and bitter, with the kind of cold that settled into bones and stayed there. Emily had spent another sleepless night in the churchyard, her thin shawl offering little protection against the autumn wind that seemed to cut through everything. Hunger gnawed at her constantly now, a sharp companion that made each step more difficult than the last. She made her way to the market square, hoping against hope that someone might have need of emergency mending or alterations. The few coins in her pocket were her last, and the growing child within her demanded nourishment she could barely provide. Her left leg ached more than usual in the cold, making her limp more pronounced as she navigated the cobblestones. The market was busy despite the weather, housewives hurrying through their weekly shopping with shawls pulled tight around their heads. Emily approached Mrs. Fletcher, whose husband ran the bakery, but the woman's face hardened the moment she spotted her. "Please," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I could your daughter's dress, or mend—" "We don't need anything from the likes of you," Mrs. Fletcher snapped, turning her back with deliberate cruelty. The rejection hit Emily like a physical blow. The world began to swim around her, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. She had eaten nothing but a crust of stale bread in 2 days, and her body was finally surrendering to the strain. Her knees buckled first, then her legs gave way entirely. She collapsed onto the cold cobblestones of the market square, her carpet bag spilling its meager contents around her. The few personal items she still owned, a small mirror, a thimble, a lock of her mother's hair, scattered across the stones like debris from a shipwreck. A crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. But instead of offering help, they stood in a circle around her fallen form, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disgust. "Look what comes of sinful behavior," one woman muttered. "A warning to decent folk," agreed another. "Someone should move her before she drives away customers," suggested the butcher. Emily lay on the stones, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind, dimly aware of the voices discussing her as though she were a piece of refuse to be swept away. No one bent down to help her. No one offered water or shelter or even a kind word. That was when Edward Hawthorne pushed through the crowd. He had come to town for winter supplies, planning to complete his business quickly and return to the solitude of his farm. But when he saw Emily collapsed on the cobblestones, something inside him shattered. The careful walls he had built around his heart crumbled in an instant, and 3 years of grief transformed into something else entirely, a fury at the cruelty of people who could watch another human being suffer without lifting a finger to help. Without a word, Edward shouldered past the gawking villagers and knelt beside Emily. Her face was pale as parchment, her breathing shallow, but steady, gently, almost reverently. He gathered her into his arms and stood. The crowd fell silent. In all his years in Millbrook, Edward Hawthorne had never made such a public display, never challenged social conventions so boldly. He was a respected member of the community, a man whose opinion carried weight despite his reclusiveness. "Shame on you," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly still market square. "Shame on all of you." Then he turned and walked away, carrying Emily toward his wagon as though she weighed nothing at all. Behind them, the crowd remained frozen in shocked silence, watching the widowed farmer claim the fallen woman as his own responsibility. Emily awakened to warmth, a sensation so foreign after weeks of cold nights that she initially thought she might be dreaming. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating a room she had never seen before. The bed beneath her was soft, the blankets heavy and comfortable, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply exist in this unexpected comfort without questioning its source. Then memory returned. The market square, the collapse, the faces staring down at her with cold indifference. She sat up carefully, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. The baby. Was the baby safe? Relief flooded through her as she felt the familiar flutter of movement within. "You're awake." "Doom." The voice came from the doorway, and Emily turned to see Edward Hawthorne standing there with a tray of food. Steam rose from a bowl of what looked like vegetable soup, and the aroma made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. "Mr. Hawthorne," she whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. Thank you, but I should go." "Where?" he interrupted, setting the tray on the small table beside the bed. "Where exactly would you go?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Emily looked down at her hands, ashamed of her circumstances, of the charity she was accepting, of the mess she had made of her life. "Eat first," Edward said more gently. "We can discuss everything else after you've had some food." The soup was simple, but nourishing. Vegetables from his own garden, seasoned with herbs that Margaret had planted years ago. Emily tried to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity, but hunger won out. She finished the bowl in minutes, along with the thick slice of bread that accompanied it. Edward watched from his position by the window, his expression unreadable. This was Margaret's room, the room she had insisted they prepare for guests who never came. He had avoided it for 3 years, unable to bear entering the space that carried so much of his wife's hope for their future. Yet bringing Emily here had felt right, necessary even. "I don't expect charity," Emily said when she had finished eating. "I can work. I'm skilled with a needle, and I'm not afraid of hard labor." "I know," Edward replied. "Mrs. Fletcher used to praise your stitchwork before recent events." The careful way he referred to her circumstances struck Emily as unexpectedly kind. No judgment, no moral lecture, just acknowledgement of facts. "The harvest is finished, but there's still plenty of work to be done preparing for winter," he continued. "The house needs attention, cleaning, mending, organizing. In exchange, you would have room and board. And when the baby comes—" Edward was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the fields that stretched toward the village. "We'll manage that when the time comes." The arrangement they discussed was practical, almost businesslike. Emily would handle the domestic duties that Edward had neglected since Margaret's death, and he would provide shelter and food. Neither mentioned the scandal it would cause, the gossip that would follow. Neither acknowledged that by bringing her here, Edward had irrevocably linked his reputation to hers. That evening, as Emily explored the cottage that would be her home, she found traces of the woman who had lived here before. Dried flowers in vases, embroidered cushions, a half-finished piece of needlework set aside 3 years ago and never touched again. Margaret Hawthorne's presence lingered in every room, but somehow it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a blessing, as though the house itself approved of this new arrangement. Edward showed Emily to a room adjacent to the kitchen, small but comfortable, with its own window overlooking the garden. As she settled in for her first warm night in weeks, she heard him moving about the cottage, the sounds of a solitary man's evening routine. For the first time since Thomas had abandoned her, Emily allowed herself to feel something that might, eventually, become hope. The first month of Emily's residence at Hawthorne Farm passed in a careful dance of domestic routine and mutual discovery. She rose each morning before dawn, as had been her habit at the boarding house, and by the time Edward emerged from his room, breakfast was ready and the kitchen already warmed by the stove. He would nod his thanks, eat in comfortable silence, and head out to tend his animals and fields. Emily found satisfaction in bringing order to the neglected cottage. 3 years of bachelor living had left their mark, dust in corners that a woman's eye would never miss, mending that had been postponed indefinitely, and a general air of things being maintained rather than cared for. She attacked these deficiencies with the methodical precision that had made her the village's most sought-after seamstress. The most challenging room was Margaret's parlour, where everything remained exactly as it had been left. Emily approached it gradually, first dusting the surfaces without disturbing their arrangement, then gently washing the curtains that had grown grey with neglect. Each small act felt like a conversation with the woman who had preceded her, not a competition, but a continuation. Edward noticed the changes without comment at first. The cottage began to smell of beeswax and lavender instead of loneliness. Meals appeared at regular times, perfectly prepared, and presented with small touches that spoke of genuine care rather than mere obligation. His clothes were mended so skillfully that he often couldn't identify where tears had been. "You didn't need to repair that," he said one evening, examining a work shirt that had torn on a fence nail weeks earlier. "It was good cloth," Emily replied simply. "Seemed wasteful to let it go to ruin." Their conversations were cautious at first, limited to practical matters and polite observations about the weather. But gradually, as autumn deepened toward winter, they began to share more substantial thoughts during the quiet hours after supper. Emily learned about Margaret, not from deliberate storytelling, but from the casual references Edward let slip when his guard was down. How she had insisted on planting roses despite the harsh soil, her tendency to sing while cooking. The way she could calm a frightened animal with nothing but her voice and gentle hands. Edward, in turn, began to understand the woman fate had brought to his doorstep. Emily's intelligence revealed itself in unexpected ways. Her observations about the farm's operations, her suggestions for improving efficiency, her quiet competence with tasks he hadn't known needed doing. She possessed a strength that her physical limitations couldn't diminish, and a grace that had nothing to do with her irregular gait. The growing child became a presence that both acknowledged but rarely discussed directly. Emily's changing shape was accommodated through subtle adjustments. Edward raised the kitchen table slightly to make her work more comfortable, and Emily let out the seams of her few dresses with the skill of a professional seamstress. When she finally felt the baby's first strong movements one evening while darning socks by the fire, Edward looked up from his account books at her sharp intake of breath. "The baby?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded, her hand pressed to her rounded stomach. Without thinking, she reached for his hand and placed it where the small fist or foot pressed against her ribs. The look that crossed Edward's face in that moment was complex. Wonder, pain, and something that might have been hope, all tangled together. "Strong," he murmured. "Margaret's baby would have been about this active," Emily said softly, surprising them both with her directness. Edward's hand remained where she had placed it, feeling the life moving beneath his palm. "Yes," he said simply. "I think so." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the fields and garden with pristine white. Inside the cottage, two people who had been broken by loss sat together in comfortable silence, connected by the promise of new life and the slow, careful growth of something that neither was quite ready to name, but both were beginning to trust. The blizzard arrived on the same night Emily's labor began, as though nature itself had conspired to make the birth as dramatic as possible. Snow pelted the cottage windows with unusual fury, and the wind howled across the fields with a voice that seemed almost alive. Emily had spent the day feeling restless and uncomfortable, unable to find a position that eased the growing pressure in her back and hips. "The storm's getting worse," Edward observed as he secured the shutters against the driving snow. "I should ride for Hannah Morrison before—" Emily's sharp gasp cut him off mid-sentence. She stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand pressed against the wall for support, the other cradled beneath her swollen belly. Water pooled on the floor around her feet. "I don't think there's time," she said, her voice tight with the effort of staying calm. Edward had assisted with difficult births before. Animals, not humans, but birth was birth. The basic principles remained the same. He helped Emily to the bedroom they had prepared, lighting additional lamps to chase away the shadows that seemed to crowd closer with each gust of wind. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his chest. He had lost Margaret and their son to childbirth. The thought of losing Emily and her baby as well was almost more than he could bear. The labor progressed with frightening intensity. Emily bore the pain with a quiet stoicism that reminded Edward of Margaret's strength, but her face grew pale with exhaustion as the hours passed. Between contractions, she apologized repeatedly for the trouble she was causing, as though bringing life into the world were somehow an inconvenience. "Stop," Edward said firmly during one such apology. "You're doing nothing wrong. You're doing everything exactly right." Near dawn, when the storm finally began to subside and Emily's strength seemed to be fading, Hannah Morrison arrived on horseback, having battled through snowdrifts that would have turned back a less determined woman. The village midwife took one look at the situation and nodded approvingly at Edward. "You've done well," she told him quietly. "The baby's positioned correctly, and she's strong. This one wants to be born." With Hannah's experienced guidance and Edward's steady support, Emily delivered a healthy daughter just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clearing clouds. The baby's cry filled the cottage, strong, indignant, and utterly alive. "A girl," Hannah announced, placing the infant in Emily's arms after a quick examination. "Perfect in every way." Emily looked down at her daughter, red-faced, dark-haired, and beautiful beyond description. The pain of the long night faded instantly, replaced by a love so fierce and immediate that it took her breath away. "Hope," she whispered, the name coming to her as naturally as breathing. "Her name is Hope." Edward, who had stepped back to give mother and daughter privacy, found himself drawn closer by the soft conversation between Emily and the baby. Hope had stopped crying and was regarding her mother with the serious expression that newborns sometimes wore, as though they were trying to make sense of this bright, strange world they had just entered. "Would you like to hold her?" Emily asked, looking up at Edward with an expression of such trust and gratitude that he felt his heart stop. Edward accepted the tiny bundle with hands that shook slightly. Hope settled against his chest as though she belonged there, her small fist curling around his finger with surprising strength. In that moment, something that had been frozen inside him for 3 years finally began to thaw. "Hello, little one," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome home." Hannah Morrison, gathering her supplies with practiced efficiency, watched the scene with approval. She had delivered dozens of babies in her 30 years as Millbrook's midwife, but she had rarely witnessed such instant bonding between a child and the man who would raise her as his own. As Emily drifted into the exhausted sleep that followed childbirth, Edward continued to hold Hope, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. Outside, the world was buried under 2 feet of snow, pristine and unmarked. Inside the cottage, a new life had begun, not just for Hope, but for all of them. 6 months after Hope's birth, the cottage had settled into the comfortable rhythms of family life. Emily had recovered her strength and resumed her sewing, but now she worked from home, with Hope sleeping in a basket beside her chair or playing on a quilt spread across the parlor floor. Word of her skill had gradually spread beyond Millbrook's borders, and she found herself with more commissions than she could easily manage. Edward had thrown himself into fatherhood with the same quiet dedication he brought to farming. He could change Hope's napkins as efficiently as any mother, soothe her tears with patient rocking, and make her laugh with silly faces that would have astonished anyone who remembered his former sternness. The sound of the baby's laughter had awakened something in the cottage itself. Rooms that had felt hollow with grief now rang with the music of life beginning again. The village's attitude toward the unusual family had evolved slowly but perceptibly. Dr. Pemberton, making a routine call to check on Hope's development, commented approvingly on the child's obvious health and contentment. Mrs. Fletcher from the bakery had begun nodding politely when she encountered Emily in the market, though she still avoided direct conversation. Most telling of all, Reverend Matthews had privately suggested to Edward that perhaps it was time to consider making their arrangement more permanent and proper. It was Mrs. Hartwell who finally broke the ice, arriving at the cottage on a crisp spring morning with a christening gown she claimed to have discovered while cleaning out her attic. "I believe this belonged to my sister's first child," she said, not quite meeting Emily's eyes. It seemed a shame to let it go unused. Emily accepted the gift graciously, recognizing the gesture for what it was. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement that perhaps her earlier judgment had been too harsh. The christening gown was exquisite, clearly the work of a master seamstress, and would be perfect for Hope's upcoming baptism. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell," Emily said simply. "It's beautiful." The older woman's composure cracked slightly. I may have been hasty in my previous decisions," she admitted. "Mr. Hawthorne is a good man, and anyone can see that child is well loved." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Emily sat with Hope in the garden, watching Edward work in the fields beyond. The baby had grown into a sunny, curious child who charmed everyone she encountered. Her dark hair had lightened to chestnut brown, and her eyes, Edward's eyes, people were beginning to say, though Emily and Edward both knew the truth, sparkled with intelligence and mischief. "What do you think, little one?" Emily asked, adjusting Hope's sunbonnet. "Should we make this official?" Hope gurgled happily and reached for a butterfly that had landed on the quilt beside them. The butterfly fluttered away, but Hope's attention was already caught by something else. The way sunlight filtered through the apple tree's leaves, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow. That evening, after Hope had been settled in her crib, Emily and Edward sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The day's work was done, the cottage peaceful around them, and the future stretched ahead, full of possibility. "The Reverend spoke to me today," Edward said quietly. "About what?" Emily asked, though she suspected she knew. "About making things proper between us. About Hope having a name that matches ours." Emily was quiet for a long moment, considering. "And what did you tell him?" "That I would speak with you first," Edward replied. "This decision affects you as much as me. More, perhaps." Emily looked out across the fields that had become her home, at the garden where Hope took her first steps, at the man who had carried her from disgrace to dignity in his arms. "I love you," she said simply. "Not from gratitude, not from convenience, but because somewhere along the way, my heart decided you were home." Edward turned to look at her, his expression soft with wonder. "And I love you," he replied. "You and Hope both. I never thought I would say those words again, but here we are." They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the village church, with Hope sleeping peacefully in Emily's arms and half of Millbrook in attendance. Not from scandal this time, but from genuine affection for the family that had shown them all what redemption looked like. The laughter of children echoed across Hawthorne Farm as Hope, now 2.5, chased chickens in the yard, while her baby brother James, named for the son Edward had lost, slept peacefully in Emily's arms. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, and the air carried the sweet scent of apple blossoms from the orchard Edward had planted the spring after their marriage. Emily sat on the porch swing Edward had built, gently rocking James while keeping one eye on Hope's adventures. Her daughter had inherited Edward's fearlessness along with his steady temperament, approaching the world with a confidence that made Emily's heart swell with pride and worry in equal measure. "Mama, chicken!" Hope called out in delight, pointing at a particularly plump hen who seemed resigned to being the object of a toddler's attention. "I see, sweetheart. Be gentle with the chickens." Edward emerged from the barn, hay dust on his clothes and satisfaction in his expression. The farm was thriving, not just financially, but in the deeper sense of being a place where life flourished. Word had spread quietly through the surrounding counties that Hawthorne Farm sometimes offered temporary shelter to those in desperate circumstances, no questions asked. A young widow with children had spent the winter with them. A pregnant girl, abandoned by her family, had stayed until she could find permanent employment in the next county. They never advertised their willingness to help, but somehow those who needed refuge found their way to the farm's door. "Mrs. Patterson brought her new baby by this morning," Emily told Edward as he settled beside her on the swing. "She wanted to thank you again for the work you gave her husband during the harvest." Edward smiled, watching Hope attempt to teach the chickens a game of her own invention. "Jim Patterson's a good worker. I was glad to have the help." This was Edward's way, always deflecting credit, always making his kindness seem like simple practicality. Emily had learned to recognize the quiet generosity that motivated so many of his decisions, the way he created opportunities for people to maintain their dignity while accepting help. James stirred in Emily's arms, making the small sounds that meant he would wake soon and demand attention. At 6 months old, he was already showing signs of his father's stubborn independence, fighting sleep when there were interesting things happening around him. "I was thinking," Emily said, adjusting the baby's blanket, "about how we ended up here. If someone had told me 3 years ago that I would be sitting on my own porch, married to a good man, watching our children play in the yard, you wouldn't have believed them," Edward finished. "No. I thought my life was over when Thomas left. I thought I had lost everything that mattered." Edward was quiet for a moment, his hand finding hers on the swing's armrest. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need. Hope had abandoned the chickens and was now attempting to climb the apple tree, her small face screwed up in concentration. Edward stood to help her, lifting her high enough to reach the lowest branch and then steadying her as she pulled herself up with determination that reminded Emily so strongly of Margaret's description that she smiled. "Careful, little bird," Edward murmured, using the pet name that had evolved naturally over Hope's first year of life. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold, the family gathered on the porch. Hope snuggled between her parents, tired from her day's adventures, while James nursed contentedly. The evening was peaceful, filled with the sounds of a farm settling into night, cattle lowing in the distance, birds calling from the orchard, the gentle creak of the porch swing. "Tell story, Papa," Hope requested sleepily, her head resting against Edward's shoulder. Edward began the tale Hope loved best, not a fairy story, but the true story of how a brave lady and a kind farmer found each other when they both needed finding most. How they built a family not from blood or convention, but from choice and love, and the determination to create something beautiful from broken pieces. As Hope drifted toward sleep and Emily held their son close, the sound of their contentment seemed to settle into the very foundations of the cottage, promising that this happiness, so hard-won and carefully tended, would endure for generations to come. The story of Emily and Edward had become the story of Hope and James, and someday it would become the story of children not yet born, all of them part of a legacy that proved families could be chosen, love could triumph over judgment, and sometimes the most beautiful beginnings grew from the most unlikely seeds. In the distance, the church bells of Millbrook chimed the hour, their sound carrying across the fields like a blessing. Emily closed her eyes and listened, remembering another evening when those same bells had seemed to toll her condemnation. Now they sang of acceptance, of community, of a place where she truly belonged. "What are you thinking about?" Edward asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression. "Just all of it," Emily replied. "How much can change, how grace can find us even when we're certain we're beyond redemption." Edward squeezed her hand gently. "Margaret used to say that broken things, when they're mended with love, become stronger than they ever were before." "She was wise," Emily said, and meant it. There was no jealousy in her voice, no competition with the memory of the woman who had come before. Margaret's love had shaped the man who was capable of loving Emily. Her loss had created the space in Edward's heart that Emily now filled. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Hope's breathing deepened into the rhythm of true sleep. James, satisfied and drowsy, had also surrendered to the peace of the evening. Emily and Edward sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the life they had built from the ashes of their separate sorrows. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. There would be crops to tend, children to raise, neighbors to help, and the endless, beautiful work of building a life worth living. But tonight, as the first fireflies began to dance in the garden, and the night air carried the scent of roses Margaret had planted, and Emily now tended, they were simply a family at peace. In the village below, other families were settling into their evening routines, and perhaps some of them remembered the scandal that had once surrounded Emily Whitmore. But more likely they thought of her now as Emily Hawthorne, the farmer's wife with the skillful hands and gentle heart, the woman who had turned a house of grief into a home of joy, the mother whose laughter could be heard across the fields when she played with her children in the garden. The transformation was complete, but more than that, it was ongoing. Each day brought new opportunities to choose love over judgment, hope over despair, grace over condemnation. And in that choosing, Emily and Edward had found not just redemption, but purpose. The sacred work of proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simple act of carrying someone home. Thank you for experiencing the story of Emily and Edward with us, a powerful tale of redemption set in 1950s rural England that shows how love can triumph over society's harshest judgments. Emily's journey from abandonment to belonging, rescued by Edward's simple act of carrying her to safety, reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments lead to our greatest blessings, and that the strongest families are built not on blood, but on the conscious choice to love and protect one another. If this heartwarming story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to join our community of readers who believe in second chances and the transformative power of compassion. We'd love to know, what country are you watching from, and which moment in Emily and Edward's journey touched your heart the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below.